under the red glow of a dying sun. The mining colony felt more like a graveyard than a place where people lived, its streets filled with dust, its homes built from rusted metal sheets, and its people walking with weary faces, and among them was Darren, a man who had worked in the mines since boyhood, his hands scarred and his back bent from years of carrying loads heavier than his spirit could bear. And though he owned little more than a shack and a small cooker that often struggled to heat the scraps he managed to buy, he always tried to keep a piece of himself unbroken, a piece that still remembered laughter, kindness, and the warmth of human connection. One evening, after a long shift underground where the air smelled of burnt stone and the walls groaned with every strike of the drills, he trudged home with a small sack of cheap grain and a handful of vegetables, already planning to stretch them into a thin stew that would last him 3 days. But as he turned down the narrow alley behind the storage silos, he stopped, for he heard a faint sound that did not belong to the colony's usual chorus of creaks and wind, a soft whimper, followed by the shuffle of something moving quickly into the shadows, and when he squinted into the dimness, he saw 2 figures crouched against the metal wall, small, fragile, and trembling. They were children, girls no older than 10, their clothes little more than rags, their faces smudged with dust, and their eyes wide with hunger and fear, and, for a moment Darren's heart clenched, because he had seen children like them before. Orphans who lost parents to mining accidents or sickness, children who learned quickly to hide or starve quietly since no one in the colony had enough to spare. But something about these 2 stopped him from walking on. Maybe it was the way the older one shielded the younger with her thin arms, or the way their eyes darted toward the sack he carried, not with greed but with desperate hope, and though Darren knew his food was barely enough for himself, he heard himself speak, his voice rough yet gentle, asking if they were hungry, and the older girl nodded without a word while the younger buried her face against her sister's chest, too shy to look up. He hesitated only a second before motioning for them to follow him, leading them to a shack, where the walls rattled with every gust of wind and the floor sagged in places, but it was dry, and it was safe, and he set down his sack while the girls stood at the doorway, uncertain if they were truly welcome. So he forced a smile and told them to sit while he prepared the stew, adding more water than usual to stretch the meal, chopping the vegetables into small pieces so there would be enough for 3 bowls, and as the pot began to bubble, the smell filled the room, rich and comforting, drawing the younger girls' eyes wide with wonder, and when he handed them each a bowl, their hands shook as they took it, and they ate slowly at first, as though afraid it might vanish if they were too quick, but soon their hunger took over and they finished every drop, leaving the bowls shining clean. Darren watched them, his own bowl still half full because he had given them most of the food, and he felt something stir in his chest, not pride, not pity, but a quiet sense of rightness, the feeling that for one night at least, he had done something that mattered. Afterward, the girls grew drowsy from the warmth of the meal, and he laid out an old blanket on his narrow bed, letting them curl together while he sat by the door, listening to the wind rattle the walls, and for the first time in years, the silence in his home did not feel heavy, but alive with the soft breathing of those who slept peacefully under his roof. Yet beneath that small comfort was a whisper of unease, for in a colony where every scrap of food was counted, people noticed when someone shared too much, and sometimes kindness was seen as weakness, and Darren wondered if he had placed himself in danger by opening his door. But when he glanced back at the 2 girls sleeping side by side, their faces no longer twisted with fear but softened with rest, he decided it was worth it, no matter the cost. Still, as he drifted into light sleep with his back against the door, he did not know that the choice he had made tonight would not only change his life but echo far beyond the colony's dusty borders, for these orphans carried a secret neither he nor anyone else could imagine. And though he would wake the next morning to find them gone without a word, their memory would remain with him like an ember buried in ash, waiting for the day when the winds of fate would fan it into a flame that could light the path to the stars. 10 years slipped by like shadows across the barren skies of the colony, and in those years Darren's life became a slow rhythm of survival, work, and silence, each day echoing the last as if time itself had grown weary of change. For the mines grew deeper and more dangerous, the machinery louder, the pay smaller, and the people thinner, and though the colony carried on, it did so like a wounded beast dragging itself across the dust, while Darren endured because he had learned long ago that endurance was the only weapon left to ordinary men. Yet despite this endless routine, there remained a memory that clung to him, sharper than any blade. The night 2 orphans had shared his fire and his food, the night their frightened faces softened with relief as they fell asleep under his roof, and though they had vanished by dawn, leaving behind only a folded blanket and faint impressions on his old bed. He could not forget them, and their absence became a quiet ache buried beneath his weary days. He often wondered if they had found another kind soul, or if the colony's cruelty had swallowed them whole, and at times, when the wind howled through the metal alleys, he swore he could hear the faint echo of their whispers, as if their memory haunted the walls themselves. Yet no matter how he searched with his eyes in the crowds or with his heart in his lonely nights, they never returned, and life pressed on, demanding all of him with nothing to give back. Still, there were moments when he thought of that night as a dream, a fragile tale his mind had woven to remind him that kindness once existed in the dust. But fate was not done with him, and on the 10th year after their disappearance, the colony awoke to a sight that shattered the weight of routine and filled the air with whispers of fear and awe. For without warning the sky burned with a strange light, brighter than any ship the miners had seen, and the ground trembled as something vast descended through the thin atmosphere, its hull gleaming like polished silver and its edges humming with energy that seemed not of Earth or any fleet known to humankind, and people poured from their homes, their faces pale, their voices hushed, pointing at the heavens as the colossal starship lowered itself above the settlement, its shadow covering the entire colony as if night had fallen in an instant, and Darren stood among them, his heart pounding. For while others muttered about invasion or doom, he felt a strange stirring deep inside, the same stirring he had felt when he looked into the eyes of two frightened children 10 years ago, though he did not yet understand why, and as the ship hovered silently, its engines whispering with a power beyond comprehension, a ramp extended slowly, groaning like the opening of a forgotten tomb, and armored figures stepped forth, their forms tall, strong, and wrapped in suits that shimmered with alien alloys, weapons slung across their backs yet carried with calm precision, and though the crowd instinctively stepped back in fear, Darren could not move, his eyes locked on the figures as two among them pulled free their helmets, revealing faces framed by long hair, eyes shining with intelligence and fire, and in that instant his breath caught, for he knew those eyes though he had not seen them in years, the same eyes that had once stared at him with hunger and hope, the eyes of the orphans he had fed, now older, now powerful, and walking toward him with purpose while the rest of the colony held its breath in stunned silence, unaware that the lives of all who stood there were about to be rewritten by a story that had begun with nothing more than a warm meal shared on a cold night. The crowd stood frozen as the towering starship loomed over the colony, its vast shadow swallowing the rusted roofs and dusty streets, and though fear had gripped most hearts, curiosity tugged just as strongly, for never before had such a vessel touched their skies, and never before had strangers arrived carrying both menace and majesty in their stance. Yet as the armored figures marched down the ramp, the silence grew heavier, broken only by the hiss of engines cooling and the whispers of wind against the metal shacks, until two of the figures reached the front and removed their helmets, revealing faces that seemed carved from both memory and destiny, faces that should have belonged only to ghosts from the past but were instead standing in the flesh before Darren, and his breath faltered as recognition struck him like a hammer, for though the years had stretched and shaped them, he saw clearly that they were the same orphan girls he had once fed in his shack on that long-forgotten night, the same pair whose hungry eyes had seared into his heart, and now they stood taller, stronger, their expressions carrying both warmth and command, as if they had walked through galaxies and returned bearing the weight of knowledge far beyond anything the colony had ever known. And while the crowd whispered in disbelief, some dropping to their knees in awe, others gripping tools or weapons in nervous fear, the two women ignored them all, their steps deliberate, their eyes fixed only on Darren, who felt his knees weaken as if the ground itself no longer trusted him to stand, and when the older of the two finally spoke, her voice carried not just across the dusty street but into every soul listening, steady yet rich with emotion, saying, "We never forgot you," and those simple words seemed to crack open the silence like a thunderclap, filling the air with questions that no one dared ask. For how could these regal visitors know a tired miner like Darren? How could their arrival in a vessel more advanced than anything humanity had built be tied to him, a man who owned nothing but scars and memories? And yet the younger sister's eyes shone with tears as she added softly, "You gave us hope when no one else would." And with those words the ground of Darren's world shifted, for in the stunned faces of the onlookers he saw disbelief, suspicion, and envy, but in the gaze of the two women he saw something far greater, something that told him his act of kindness, so small and so easily forgotten by him, had not only survived across time but had grown into something powerful, and though he tried to speak, his throat closed, for what could a miner say to two who had returned from the stars? Yet the moment held him captive, charged with a suspense that pressed tighter with every heartbeat, for deep down he knew this was not a reunion of chance, it was the beginning of something larger, and the secret that the sisters carried, the truth hidden in their journey, would soon tear open the fragile walls of the colony and reveal a destiny that Darren had never dared to imagine. The air in the colony grew heavy as the two sisters stood before Darren, their presence commanding silence even among the boldest of men, and though the people whispered of miracles and curses, no one dared step forward, for everyone sensed that something far greater than their small world was unfolding, and when the older sister began to speak, her words carried the weight of stars themselves. Her voice calm yet filled with memories that stretched beyond anything the crowd could comprehend, telling of how, on the night they had vanished from his shack, they had not simply disappeared into the alleys but had been found by travelers unlike any Darren had ever imagined, beings from beyond the known systems who recognized something rare in them, not just survival but spirit, and these beings had taken the orphans across galaxies where they were taught the ways of science, diplomacy, and leadership, shaped into women who could walk among councils of countless species and command respect, where even seasoned warriors bowed, and though their journey had been one of hardship and training beyond human endurance, they carried with them a memory that never faded, the memory of a poor miner who, despite having little, chose to share his food and warmth, showing them that compassion could burn brighter than hunger or fear, and as she spoke, the younger sister's eyes met Darren's with a tenderness that softened the steel in her voice, as if to remind him that beneath the armor and the authority they still carried the same hearts that once beat in terror in the cold streets, and while the crowd shifted uneasily, torn between awe and disbelief, Darren stood frozen, overwhelmed by the thought that his small act of kindness had rippled across the stars, shaping the lives of two who now stood as emissaries of powers unknown, and he struggled to understand why they had come back, why they now stood before him, until the older sister revealed that their return was not merely gratitude but purpose, for they had come to extend a hand to humanity, to invite them into a greater union of civilizations, but they had chosen to begin not with governments or generals, but with him, the man whose compassion had been the seed of all that followed, and the words struck Darren like a storm, leaving him breathless, for he had always believed himself small, forgotten by the universe. Yet now the universe was at his door because he had once chosen to care, and while the crowd gasped, murmuring of destiny, opportunity, and fear of alien traps, Darren realized that the quiet choice he had made 10 years ago had become the thread tying his world to the stars, and though he did not yet understand the full weight of what they were offering, he felt the stir of something long buried, a sense that his life was no longer his own, that the hidden truth carried by these sisters would not only change him but unravel the very boundaries of humanity's future. The crowd held its breath as the sisters stepped closer to Darren, their armor glinting in the fading sunlight while the massive starship loomed above like a silent guardian, and though murmurs rippled through the onlookers, some in awe, others in fear, the sisters ignored them, their attention fixed only on the man who once gave them bread and warmth when they had nothing, and it was then that the older sister raised her hand, signaling to the guards behind her, and at once the armored figures parted to reveal a gleaming object resting on a hovering platform, its polished surface reflecting the red sky, its form alien yet graceful, a vessel in miniature compared to the giant starship above, but still larger than anything the colony had ever seen, a ship with lines that seemed alive, humming with an energy that made the air vibrate, and the people gasped as they realized it was no mere token, no simple gift, but a starship in its own right, one meant not for an army or a council, but for a single person, and when the younger sister spoke, her voice trembled with the weight of the moment as she said, "This is yours, Darren, for the kindness you gave us when the galaxy gave us nothing," and the words struck him harder than any pickaxe blow, for he had spent his life believing himself ordinary, invisible among miners, a man who scraped by with nothing to offer the world but his labor. Yet here he stood with a ship offered to him, a vessel whose technology surpassed anything built by human hands, and the crowd erupted into cries of disbelief, jealousy, and fear, some shouting that it was a trick, others demanding why he was chosen, but the sisters silenced them with a glance before turning back to Darren, explaining that true greatness was not measured in wealth or status, but in the choice to give when one had nothing, for compassion was the rarest strength in the universe, and they had built their entire rise upon the memory of his act, carrying it like a compass across the stars, and now they wished to return that gift by placing in his hands the power to rise above the dust and lead his people into a new chapter of existence. Darren's heart pounded as he stared at the vessel, its surface glowing faintly as if it already knew him, as if it was alive and waiting, and though doubt gnawed at him, whispers that he was only a miner, unfit for such destiny, another voice within whispered louder, reminding him of the night he had chosen kindness over hunger, and in that choice had unknowingly changed the path of 2 lost children, and perhaps now he could change even more. Yet as his hand hovered uncertainly toward the ship's glowing frame, a chill spread across him, not of fear but of the unknown. For in that moment he understood that this was no simple gift, it was a door, and stepping through it would mean leaving behind everything he knew, everything safe, and walking into a future where the eyes of not just his colony but the stars themselves would follow him, waiting to see what he would do next. The colony seemed to vanish into silence as Darren stood before the gift that shimmered with power beyond human reach, the smallest starship glowing faintly as if it breathed, and though his calloused hands trembled when he reached out, he felt a warmth travel through his skin, a pulse that matched his heartbeat, as though the vessel itself had been waiting only for him, and the people watching could not believe their eyes. For a miner who had spent his life in dust and sweat was now chosen by those who had returned from the stars, yet what unsettled them more was not the sight of the ship but the knowledge that the sisters had placed the weight of destiny on his shoulders, and when Darren finally stepped closer, the vessel responded, its frame unfolding, its ramp lowering as if inviting him home, and whispers spread like fire through the crowd. Some whispered of glory, some of betrayal, some of fear that he would leave them behind, but the sisters stood firm, their eyes fixed on him, with pride and trust, and when the older one spoke again, her voice was soft but carried to every ear, saying that the future of humanity would not be decided by the powerful or the wealthy, but by those who remembered compassion in the darkest hours, and Darren felt his chest tighten, for he knew her words were true yet he feared he could never live up to them. Still, when he looked back at the colony, at the tired faces and hollow eyes of those who had always been trapped by the mines, he realized that if he walked away, nothing would ever change, but if he accepted, even in doubt, he could open a path not just for himself but for all of them, and so with one last breath of the dusty air he had known his whole life, he placed his foot on the ramp and stepped inside, the interior lighting up in streams of blue and silver, wrapping him in a glow that seemed to wash away the years of struggle. And as he touched the central console, it came alive, holograms flickering, stars spinning around him, and the entire colony gasped as the ship rose from the ground with a sound like thunder, dust swirling in great storms, people shielding their eyes as Darren's figure was framed by light through the vessel's open hatch, and though fear lingered in some hearts, awe burned brighter, for they knew they were witnessing the beginning of something larger than their world, and as the starship ascended, guided not by the will of soldiers or rulers but by the compassion of one man, who once gave food to 2 children, a new story was born, one that would carry his name beyond the mines, beyond the colony, beyond Earth itself, into the endless stretch of stars where destiny waited. And in that moment, Darren understood that the universe did not remember the strong or the rich, it remembered the kind, and from the smallest act of kindness, entire galaxies could be changed forever.